Good evening. I'm Teresa Skubic, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, April 3rd. U.S. President Donald Trump announced his long-awaited plan on Wednesday to impose what he's calling retaliatory tariffs on imports coming from dozens of countries. But the White House said there will be no more across-the-board levies applied to Canada than what has already been announced. However, Mr. Trump said that he's going ahead with a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles, which could have severe implications for the Canadian auto sector.
Likewise, until today, the United States has for decades charged a 2.5 tariff. Think of that, 2.5% on foreign-made automobiles. The European Union charges us more than 10% tariffs, and they have 20% VATs, much, much higher. India charges 70%, and perhaps worst of all are the non-monetary restrictions imposed by South Korea, Japan, and very many other nations. As a result of these colossal trade barriers, 81% of the cars in South Korea are made in South Korea. 94% of the cars in Japan are made in Japan. Toyota sells 1 million foreign-made automobiles into the United States, and General Motors sells almost none. Ford sells very little. None of our companies are allowed to go into other countries. And I say that, friend and foe. And in many cases, the friend is worse than the foe in terms of trade. But such horrendous imbalances have devastated our industrial base and put our national security at risk. I don't blame these other countries at all for this calamity. I blame former presidents and past leaders who weren't doing their job. They let it happen. And they let it happen to an extent that nobody can even believe. That's why, effective at midnight, we will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles.
Mr. Trump also said he would apply a minimum baseline tariff of 10% on all goods coming into the U.S., with rates higher for countries he said have been ripping off Americans.
At the same time, we will establish a minimum baseline tariff of 10%. You notice that on the chart? And that'll be on other countries to help rebuild our economy and to prevent cheating. So we're going to have a minimum of cheating, and we're going to be very severe on the people that at the gate that watch the tariffs and watch the product coming in, because there's been a lot of bad things happening at the gate because the money is so enormous that you're talking about. There's never been probably anything like it in terms of the enormity. And there are a lot of bad things happen at the people that do the check-in, and they're looking at 10-year jail sentences if they do play. We're going to treat them so good, but if they cheat, the repercussions are going to be extremely strong.
Prime Minister Mark Carney said that the reciprocal tariffs announced by Donald Trump will, quote, fundamentally change the international trading system.
President Trump has just announced a series of measures that are going to fundamentally change the international trading system. Now, in doing so, he has preserved a number of important elements of our relationship, the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States. But the fentanyl tariffs still remain in place, as do the tariffs for steel and aluminum. As of this evening, the tariffs on automobiles will enter into force, and the U.S. has signaled that there will be additional tariffs in so-called strategic sectors, pharmaceuticals, lumber, and semiconductors. So we're in a situation where there is going to be an impact on the U.S. economy, which will build with time. In our judgment, it will be negative on the U.S. economy. That will have an impact on us. But the series of measures will directly affect millions of Canadians.
And this morning, the Prime Minister held a press conference in Ottawa where he announced Canada will be retaliating against Trump's trade policy with a 25% tariff on vehicles imported from the U.S. that are not compliant with the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement.
And today I'm announcing that the Government of Canada will be responding by matching the U.S. approach, with 25% tariffs on all vehicles imported from the United States that are not compliant with CUSMA, our North American Free Trade Agreement, and on the non-Canadian content of CUSMA-compliant vehicles from the United States as well. Our tariffs, though, unlike the U.S. tariffs, will not affect auto parts. because we know the benefits of our integrated production system. And they will also not affect vehicle content from Mexico, who is respecting the CUSMA agreement.
Mark Carney said that the president preserved some aspects of the Canada-U.S. commercial relationship by delaying the full use of reciprocal tariffs. But he said that the auto tariffs that will take effect are particularly concerning. Dr. Moshe Lander, economist and professor at Concordia University, joined us to explain how the previous and new tariffs will affect the Canadian economy.
Any tariff is bad news for the Canadian economy. We've essentially gone 80 years moving towards freer and freer trade. So this is a big step backwards. So the tariffs that are being imposed on us are going to cause job losses. They're going to cause GDP to contract, which means we're going to be talking about a recession. We could be talking about inflationary pressures, which could mean that the interest rate cuts stop, but they could even go into reverse. We're going to retaliate, which is going to inflict further damage in the hopes that somehow the Americans will come to their senses. But medium to long term, the fact that we've now seen that our biggest trade partner, our neighbor, our ally can do a 180 on trade policy means that any future president is going to be suspect, not just Trump, but let's say that there's another Republican president. What if they go to the playbook and say, well, the last time we tried this, the Canadians came on bended knee and gave us stuff that we want. I have other issues with Canada. And it could even happen with the Democratic president who decides that maybe they don't like our stance on the environment or an issue that's near and dear to the Democrats. So we have much bigger problems, medium to long term, even when the tariffs go away. There's no way that tariffs make the economy stronger. Medium term, long term, tomorrow, never. It doesn't happen. There's only one circumstance where you could make the argument that tariffs could actually benefit an economy. And it's such a long shot scenario that it's not even worth trying to see if it's true. And that's if you could do the tariff equivalent of Trump's threat 8 years ago that I'm going to build a wall and get Mexico to pay for it. So if we could put tariffs on somebody and get them to pay for the tariffs instead of our own citizens, then we would generate some money from them to pay for the tariffs. And we would get the benefits of increased production domestically. But that's a long shot because what you're assuming, first of all, is that you can pick on some country and they're not going to try and fight back. And that nobody bigger is going to try that to us. So there's no way that this benefits the overall economy. What tariffs do is they benefit sectors of the economy. So if we put tariffs on American products, Canadian producers who have to compete with those American companies say, I actually like these tariffs. It now gives me a chance to increase my production because we don't have to worry about American competition. Take a look at the way that Canadian businesses are saying that all of a sudden Canadians want to buy Canadian where they weren't buying Canadian 6 months ago. But if we add up their gains, and we subtract from it the losses of consumers who now see higher prices, lesser variety of goods, and that they don't have access to the things that they once did. The losses outweigh the gains. So overall society is weaker, even if you factor in the government tax revenue that they generate.
Dr. Lander also unpacked the role that tariffs will play on the American economy.
Inflation will remain high, interest rates will remain high, GDP will fall, the jobs that he's expecting to materialize won't happen, certainly not immediately. It's not like you can snap a finger and open up an auto factory overnight. But even in the medium to long term, given his attacks on immigrants and foreign nationals operating in the country, you're not going to be able to fill those factories even if somehow they were to start opening. So you're going to need a radical change in the entire industrial base of the US. But what you're doing is you're taking jobs away from sectors that have shown themselves to be world leaders and now diverting them towards industries that have been shown that could be done more productively elsewhere. So productivity in the US is going to decline. There's just really nothing that's going to be good here other than a few sectors that he's identified as being key to his political base that might stand to gain from the tariffs because they're going to be able to hide behind the tariffs and expand their production. But there is no way that this is a benefit to the US in any capacity. I don't know necessarily that their economy was weak enough to begin with, that the tariffs are going to tip them into recession, but it's not really an issue of whether GDP starts declining. It's whether it starts growing slower than what it could be or should be. That's the type of thing that could feel like a recession, even if it's not technically a recession.
Financial markets around the world are reeling following Donald Trump's latest volley of tariffs, and the U.S. stock market may be taking the worst of it. The S&P 500 was down 3.3% in early trading, worse than the drops for other major stock markets. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was down 1,160 points, or 2.7% as of 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time, and the Nasdaq Composite was 4.5% lower. While speaking at a rally in Kingston, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre addressed Donald Trump's auto tariffs, calling them, quote, an unfair attack on our economy.
You know, before I get into the broader context of my remarks tonight, I should address yet another unfair attack on our economy from the U.S. president. In addition to unfair and counterproductive tariffs on our aluminum and steel, now President Trump is going after our auto workers. After, for decades, workers on both sides of the border locked arms to build the greatest auto sector in the world, the president is betraying America's closest friend and attacking our economy, proving once again that Canada must end its era of overdependence and weakness. We must be an economic fortress that can defend itself, that can stand up for its own people, and put Canada first. Conservatives will be there for the auto workers, to keep them working, to keep their jobs, to fight through this mess. We will push hard to put an end to these tariffs and get a quick but fair deal that protects our sovereignty, knocks down all the tariffs, and allows us to rebuild our military so that we can be a true sovereign nation.
Our contributor Wyatt Sharp unpacked the role that Mr. Trump's announcement has played on Mark Carney and Mr. Poilievre's stance on tariffs.
Yeah, experts have pointed out that while certainly the intent behind some of Donald Trump's tariffs were to protect American jobs, the actual outcome that has resulted from them was certainly less targeted and more damaging than anticipated in a number of instances as well. These, what are really being described as across-the-board tariffs, including the proposed 10 to 20% tariff on all imported goods, raised prices for consumers, but also disrupted supply chains. And while the intent was, at least on Donald Trump's behalf, to do that for Canada, certainly you're seeing it happen in the United States as well, with forecasters projecting the average cost of living for the average American family to go up by about 900 American dollars per year. And, with these disrupted, kind of global supply chains comes the kind of sacrifice of the intended boost that was expected in a lot of domestic production as well. And, I tell you all of this because it's kind of shaping Pierre Poilievre's stance on a lot of these tariffs. And you're not actually seeing that much kind of protest from Mark Carney towards Pierre Poilievre's stance and vice versa, because largely it is the same. Now, there might be some discrepancies with respect to how different some of the retaliatory tariffs they're looking to put in place are, or what they want to put in place retaliatory tariffs on, but Pierre Poilievre proposing really a different approach to trade and tariffs, advocating for what oftentimes can seem like kind of a more measured approach to dealing with these, but also strategically speaking. If you look to Donald Trump, one of the biggest criticisms right now is that he doesn't understand kind of the impact of these tariffs, the fundamental principle of tariffs, that they are in fact placed on the importer, which perhaps sometimes he oftentimes looks at it from the opposite perspective. Pierre Poilievre has said he's not just looking at protecting industries, although that is certainly very important, but also looking to enhance Canada's relations on the geopolitical stage around the world. And Mark Carney is echoing that message by saying that, they're looking to really diversify our trade markets to countries in Europe potentially as well. With that, of course, would come some additional transportation costs, but if it looks at like it can provide more stability essentially towards the Canadian economy, Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney both saying that they think it is something worth looking at. Poilievre's plan really as well, just to conclude with this, kind of suggests really what can ultimately seem like a pivot, right, from Trump's kind of broader, less measured policy towards kind of a more nuanced strategy aiming to avoid some of the pitfalls that oftentimes look as if they're arising from, economic isolation, to, looking at things like fostering domestic growth and international cooperation. One thing you're hearing a lot of U.S. economists in particular talk about is that the reason the economy in the U.S. is likely to hurt from this is because Trump is trying too much to prioritize the domestic production angle on kind of the balancing scale here. And as a result, because he's focusing so much on that, it's really making the issue worse, and it's having the opposite effect as he had initially anticipated. So certainly there are a lot of interesting developments with respect to this. The global economy obviously is going to evolve as well as we move forward. Canada's going to play a big part in that. But again, both Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney, it seems, are actually quite united, or more united than many would anticipate on this front.
In an interview with CNN's Caitlin Collins, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent urged other countries not to issue retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. following Mr. Trump's announcement. Mr. Bessent said, quote, "My advice to every country right now is do not retaliate. Sit back, take it in, let's see how it goes."
Well, Caitlin, one of the messages that I'd like to get out tonight is everybody sit back, take a deep breath, don't immediately retaliate. Let's see where this goes, because if you retaliate, that's how we get escalation.
And then it becomes a full-fledged trade war, in your view?
Not a trade war, depends on the country, but remember that the history of trade is we are the deficit country. The deficit country has an advantage. They are the surplus countries. The surplus countries traditionally always lose any kind of a trade escalation. So I did, as a student of economic history or a professor of economic history, I'd advise against it.
So you're essentially saying that they should not retaliate?
I would say that doing anything rash would be unwise.
In an interview with News Nation, Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he's cautiously optimistic that Canada was not on the list of countries that will face new reciprocal tariffs announced on Wednesday.
Termination Day. Mr. Premier, thanks for being with us tonight here on the Hill. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much, Blake. Always great to be with you.
Of course. So you saw the chart. The first thing that I noticed, sir, it did not have Canada. It did not have Mexico. So in a way, do you feel as if the president sort of spared you today, or no?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Okay.
I think the best thing that we could do is have 0% tariffs with ourselves and our greatest trading partner in the world, your number one customer, our number one customer. And we're just so much stronger together, Blake, when we share so many different areas, our values, integrated trade, not just the auto sector, but so many other sectors. So I think we'll have to dig deep into this and sit down with the administration and see exactly what this means.
Mr. Ford said that the Ontario government will be in contact with the U.S. administration and is working closely with the federal government. He said that he is vowing to keep U.S. alcohol off LCBO shelves and will continue fighting for zero tariffs. And New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt spoke out following Mr. Trump's announcement, saying that while Canada was spared the worst, quote, that uncertainty doesn't go away.
Even though we don't see new tariffs on Canada today, that uncertainty hasn't gone away. You don't treat your neighbors like this. We know that these tariffs, these unnecessary taxes, end badly for both of our countries. I think that is a fair assessment. We were anticipating some level of tariff on some aspect of our economy. So to be sitting here today without new tariffs on Canada aside from the automobile sector, that is better than we might have expected. I'm not prepared to celebrate yet because we want more clarity, and we have seen with this U.S. administration that what they say one day can change the next. But so far it appears that the hard work that's been done by a lot of people to make clear to the U.S. how connected we are and what good trading partners we are is paying off. I was just on the phone with a congressperson, well, on a Zoom call, I guess, from Idaho, making that exact point, and he's in contact with his representatives in the White House to highlight how much business Idaho does with Canada and how the trade imbalance goes the other way. And those voices are coming up more and more to the point where today we are relieved that there are not new tariffs in place on New Brunswickers.
In a province where over 90% of exports go to the U.S., Ms. Holt said that the province's plan to financially support industries impacted here and boycott U.S. businesses will continue.
So the plan that we announced on March 4th remains in place. We are focused on providing support for affected New Brunswickers, support for New Brunswick entrepreneurs and businesses who, even with this current tariff, without the tariffs announced today, the uncertainty has meant an impact to their purchases and to their clients and to their business activities. And so our support program announced remains in place. To date, our government has undertaken many steps to respond. We have stopped the purchasing of U.S. goods. We've signed no new contracts with the United States. We have tabled legislation to promote labor mobility. We have established regular interfaces with New Brunswick exporters, with our border communities, and with counterparts in the United States, governors, congresspeople, senators, to continue the push for a tariff-free regime between Canada and New Brunswick.
Officials with Unifor Local 444, which represents workers at Stellantis' Windsor assembly plant, say that they've received notification from the automaker that the facility will shut down 2 weeks starting April 7th. They admit that the move is not entirely unexpected, but say that the company cited Mr. Trump's latest tariff announcement on Wednesday afternoon as the primary factor driving the decision. The notice also suggests that the more changes to the plant schedule are expected in the coming weeks. Ontario Premier Doug Ford reacted to the news today, saying, quote, "Well, in my opinion, we have to respond." He said, "Let's pray it's only a couple of weeks." Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says a Conservative government will remove the GST from Canadian-made autos, an idea first put forward by the NDP. Mr. Poilievre said that the move will increase demand for Canadian cars and keep more workers employed.
We need to protect auto workers in Oshawa, Cambridge, Brampton, Windsor, Essex, St. Catharines, Oakville, Alliston, Woodstock, Ingersoll, and elsewhere. That's why I'm announcing today that a new Conservative government will eliminate the federal sales tax on Canadian-made automobiles. Everyone who's looking to buy Canadian, to support Canadian workers, will be able to save money as a result of this announcement. Axing the GST on a $50,000 Canadian-made automobile will save $2,500 to the car buyer. By saving cash-strapped Canadians' families their hard-earned money, we will increase demand for Canadian-made cars and keep more workers on the job. And I'm calling on the premiers to match our policy and remove their portion of provincial sales tax on Canadian-made automobiles.
The Manitoba government has announced additional supports for the province's agriculture sector following the new U.S. tariffs. Premier Wab Kinew announced on Wednesday that the province will provide $10.7 million in matching funds for the federal agri-stability program, which helps producers affected by large declines in income.
We're here to share some of our plans for how we protect Manitoba, we protect your jobs, and we continue to build our economy. So your jobs are super important. And the base message that I want to share to each and every one of you is this. We're going to work together. We're going to work together as all levels of government, great employers like Maple Leaf, unions like UFCW, so that we can deliver on a very simple promise, that your jobs are going to be here today, your jobs will be here tomorrow, and your jobs will continue to be here long after Donald Trump leaves office. So a lot of people have been feeling that there's uncertainty. A lot of people have been feeling that the future has a lot of risk because of what Donald Trump has announced. And so today, we're announcing specific programs for the agriculture sector here in Manitoba. Our budget, our new budget for 2025, has $140 million in business risk management supports, programs like Agri-Invest and Agri-Stability. And the news that the federal government is going to be lifting the cap and lifting the threshold that triggers agri-stability meant that our great Ag Minister, Ron Kostishin, as well as our team, are working together to match that initiative. So that represents another $10.7 million that the provincial government is bringing forward to support pork producers, agricultural producers, and to support jobs in facilities like this one. Our budget this year, 2025 budget, also had a $100 million contingency reserve fund added for the ag industry. So when you put all these initiatives together, $76 million for ag insurance, $16 million for ag invest, the $10.7 million top up in response to the federal program changes that the Prime Minister's announced, you put that all together, there's $250 million in potential supports for the agricultural industry that we're bringing forward to protect our economy and to protect your jobs against tariffs.
The federal government expanded the program late last month, increasing the compensation rate for 2025 while doubling the cap for payoffs to $6 million. Following Mr. Trump's Liberation Day, the Canadian sectors that are being hit the hardest are the auto sector, steel, aluminum, and energy products. However, during Mr. Trump's announcement, the president said that Canada imposes a 250 to 300% tariff on U.S. dairy products.
With today's actions, we're also standing up for our great farmers and ranchers who are brutalized by nations all over the world. It's brutalized. Canada, by the way, imposes a 250 to 300% tariff on many of our dairy products. They do the first can of milk. They do the first little carton of milk at a very low price, but after that it gets bad, and then it gets up to 275, 300%. So when they're figuring what's Canada charging, they say, oh, about 2%, 3%. But take a look at what happens down the road. When you look a little bit, it's not a pretty picture, and we don't like it, and it's not fair. It's not fair to our farmers. It's not fair to our country. And with countries like Canada, you know, we subsidize a lot of countries and keep them going and keep them in business.
We were joined by Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University, to discuss how Canada's agri-food sector was spared from the tariffs.
It's a huge relief, obviously, because a 10% tariff would have been a disaster for the agri-food sector. So yesterday, I think, was a good day for the agri-food sector in Canada. But there are some lingering issues still. Non-CUSMA goods are still being tariffed right now with the U.S., and that would include wheat, for example. India has tariffs against lentils. China has tariffs against canola, pork, and lobster, for example. So we're not out of the woods. The agri-food sector in Canada is still under tremendous pressure. The good news coming out of yesterday, obviously, for food manufacturers, for many months now, many food manufacturers were thinking about relocating to the U.S., or at least find a place to manufacture in the U.S. to not be exposed to tariffs, but that's not going to be necessary. So, of course, Ottawa's response is going to be key here. We don't know exactly how Ottawa will respond, but how I'm reading what's coming out of Ottawa right now is a little different than when Prime Minister Trudeau was around. I think it seems as though the approach, at least under Mark Carney, seems more targeted and strategic. The dollar for dollar approach seems to be over now, which is good. And Mr. Carney did claim a few days ago that he wouldn't tariff American food products coming into Canada, which is really good news for Canadian consumers.
Dr. Charlebois also unpacked Mr. Trump's reasoning behind not implementing reciprocal tariffs on Canadian dairy after mentioning the tariffs Canada imposes on U.S. dairy products.
I think it's a threat, but it's certainly a presidential warning for what's to come, for sure. I actually think that right now, dairy is clearly targeted. It was really interesting that Mr. Trump didn't mention anything about poultry or eggs. Both of them are under the SM5 regime, and so it appears that dairy is really a focus for the Trump administration. So I think basically what we got yesterday was a warning for what's to come, with new negotiations coming down the pipe. And I'm just hoping at some point that the dairy sector will start figuring out that something needs to change domestically, because if we continue on this path of conceding and then, of course, compensating dairy farmers for no losses, really, all of the losses that are being claimed are hypotheticals, really. It's not necessarily a strategy that we want to pursue, because everyone loses, including the dairy sector.
Lastly, he touched on what changes Canada's dairy and agri-food sectors need to be making in order to continue to avoid tariffs.
I think market access is going to be key, but as soon as you do that, then you compromise the entire governance of the policy itself. I mean, if you allow more milk or dairy products into the Canadian market, you're basically eroding the influence of quotas that are managed by provinces. And so you got to rethink the entire system altogether. If you actually concede and provide more access to the Americans, you have no choice but to think about how quotas are managed, how pricing is being set at farm gate by the Canadian Dairy Commission, of course. And right now, Canadian industrial milk is double the price of what it is in the US. So our sector is clearly not competitive at all. So we're not ready for this.
The Legault government is delighted with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's pitch to create an autonomy alliance with Quebec to obtain more power within the Canadian Federation. Simon Jolin Barrett, the province's minister responsible for Canadian relations, said Quebec is open to meeting with Ms. Smith to discuss her proposal to create a common front for greater autonomy. He said his government is especially pleased with Alberta's decision to back Quebec in the upcoming Supreme Court challenge of Bill 21. Freedom Convoy organizers Tamara Leach and Chris Barber heard a verdict today in the joint trial over their roles in the mass protests against pandemic health measures that rolled into Ottawa more than 3 years ago. Ms. Leach and Mr. Barber, both charged with mischief, intimidation, and counseling others to break the law in retaliation to their roles in the 2022 protest that drew thousands of demonstrators to Ottawa for 3 weeks. Ontario Court Justice Heather Perkins McVeigh says that the evidence shows that the duo routinely encouraged people to continue to remain at and join in the protests, despite knowing the effects it was having on downtown residents and businesses. An Ontario Public Health Unit has ordered the suspension of 1,624 elementary students for out-of-date vaccination records. The region of Waterloo Public Health issued the notice under the Immunization of School Pupils Act on Wednesday morning. The act requires all elementary and high school students at public and private schools to be immunized against a number of childhood diseases. The act also requires public health bodies to maintain vaccination records for all private and public school students in their respective areas. Public health bodies have the authority to suspend students from school if they do not receive an up-to-date immunization record or a valid exemption, which must be provided by parents or guardians, as healthcare providers do not report those records. Yesterday, President Donald Trump unveiled a bold move in international trade, announcing a 20% tariff on the European Union.
European Union, they're very tough, very, very tough traders. You think of European Union, very friendly. They rip us off. It's so sad to see. It's so pathetic. 39%, we're going to charge them 20%, so we're charging them essentially half.
Reacting to the tariffs announcement, EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen said that the universal tariffs announced by the U.S. are a major blow to businesses and consumers worldwide, and that Europe is prepared to respond.
President Trump's announcement of universal tariffs on the whole world, including the European Union, is a major blow to the world economy. I deeply regret this choice. Let's be clear-eyed about the immense consequences. The global economy will massively suffer. Uncertainty will spiral and trigger the rise of further protectionism. The consequences will be dire for millions of people around the globe, also for the most vulnerable countries, which are now subject to some of the highest US tariffs. The opposite of what we wanted to achieve. The tariffs will also hurt consumers around the world. It will be felt immediately. Millions of citizens will face higher grocery bills, Medication will cost more, as well as transportation. Inflation will go up. And this is hurting in particular the most vulnerable citizens. This is why from the outset we have always been ready to negotiate with the United States to remove the remaining barriers to transatlantic trade. At the same time, we are prepared to respond. We are already finalizing the first package of countermeasures in response to tariffs on steel. And we're now preparing for further countermeasures to protect our interests and our businesses if negotiations fail. We will also be watching closely what indirect effects these tariffs could have, because we cannot absorb global overcapacity, nor will we accept dumping on our markets. As Europeans, we will always promote and defend our interests and our values, and we will always stand up for Europe.
Ireland's Prime Minister Michael Martin responded to the tariffs by saying, quote, "I deeply regret the U.S.'s decision to impose 20% tariffs on imports from across the European Union. We see no justification for this."
Hello. I strongly believe that tariffs benefit no one. They're bad for the world economy. They hurt people. They hurt businesses. And so I regret deeply the decision of the US administration this evening to levy a tariff of 20% on all goods imported from the European Union. My priority and that of the government is to protect Irish jobs and the Irish economy. And we will work with our companies, multinational companies and Irish companies, to navigate the period ahead. We will work with our European Union colleagues in getting on a negotiation pathway with the US to limit the damage of these tariffs. And we'll also work bilaterally with the US, pointing out the added value and the strength that Ireland has given to so many US companies who are located in Ireland and who export to the European Union and to Asia and across the world. So government will continue to work on behalf of the Irish people in the context of tonight's announcement to protect Irish jobs and the Irish economy.
The CEO and executive director of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress spoke in Ottawa on Wednesday in order to present the organization's policy priorities ahead of the April 28th federal election. The executive director began with discussing priorities related to Canadian security and defense before pivoting to changing Canada's relationship with Russia to including the implementation of a full trade embargo against the country.
We believe Canada needs to substantially increase our spending on defense to 3% of GDP, making investments in our domestic defense industry, in our air and naval defense, securing our Arctic, and looking at developing a nuclear deterrent independent of the United States. We need to increase weapons and ammunition deliveries to Ukraine, keep on providing economic support, working with allies to seize over $300 billion in Russian assets frozen in Western financial institutions. Canada should continue to stand for NATO's open door policy and support Ukraine's accession to NATO. Fourth, isolating Russia and holding Russia to account. We believe Canada should continue to lead the international coalition for the return of Ukrainian children and support the establishment of an international tribunal to prosecute the crimes Russia has committed. Canada should designate Russia as a state supporter of terror and sever all diplomatic ties. Finally, Canada should implement a full trade embargo against Russia.
Another aspect of the UCC's election priorities focused on supporting Ukrainians displaced in Canada.
The hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who've come to Canada on the QIT visa program need certainty and the ability to work. Canada should automatically extend their work permits until 2028 and provide pathways to permanent residency for displaced Ukrainians and their families, as well as continuing to support community organizations who are working to integrate these newcomers. We believe that Canada should work with their provincial governments and local governments to simplify recognition of foreign credentials.
The UCC is not tied to any federal parties and works with all national parties to represent the group's interests and to build better ties between Canada and Ukraine. And Israel announced a major expansion of military operations in Gaza on Wednesday, saying large areas would be seized and added to its security zones, accompanied by a large-scale evacuation of the population.
Let me start with an operational update from Gaza. In a video message last night, the Prime Minister confirmed that Israel's defense forces have intensified operations against Hamas and other terrorist groups across the Gaza Strip. The IDF is striking terrorists and their infrastructure, securing key positions, and systematically dividing Gaza step by step, tightening the pressure until Hamas has no choice but to release our hostages. Israel's message could not be clearer. The pressure will continue to mount until they are freed. We have returned to fighting with a clear and unwavering mission to bring home all of our hostages, both the living and the deceased, to dismantle Hamas's military and governing capabilities, and to eliminate the terror threat from Gaza once and for all. Hamas continues to violate international law, embedding itself in civilian sites, hospitals, schools and mosques, while using the people of Gaza as human shields. Right now, 59 hostages remain in captivity. Their return is a national and it is a moral imperative. We will not stop until every last one of them is home. Indeed, as the IDF's Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, has said just last night, the only thing that can halt our further advance is the release of our hostages. And the Prime Minister said pretty much the same thing. He said that with God's help and with the bravery of our soldiers, we will achieve this mission.
The Israeli military had already issued evacuation warnings to Gazans living around the southern city of Rafah and toward the city of Khan Yunis. And on Wednesday, Rogers Communication and the NHL announced a 12-year agreement for the national media rights to NHL games on all platforms in Canada through the 2037 to 2038 season. The $11 billion agreement starts in 2026 to 2027, following the conclusion of the current landmark 12-year deal, extending the strategic partnership to over 2 decades. This gives Rogers national rights across TV, streaming, and digital for all regular season and playoff games, plus the Stanley Cup Final and all special events. This also extends to coverage in all languages and all regions. Under the new agreement, fans will have access to more live national games than ever before and fewer regional blackouts. I'm Teresa Skupik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on X and TikTok. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the Newsforum YouTube channel. Good night, Canada.